The clock above the entrance door clicked to 11:54 p.m. Outside, the streets of Maple Hollow were silent, bathed in the pale orange glow of old sodium lamps. The small-town radio station, WZPH 103.4 FM, stood at the corner of Main Street, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the cold autumn air. The glass door reflected a man's shape as he approached, his figure framed by the dim light spilling from the lobby. Dan Harper, 42, tall but slightly stooped from years of sitting in studio chairs, stepped inside. His coat was dusted with a thin layer of frost, and his breath still lingered in the cold air before vanishing. The building smelled faintly of dust, coffee, and the metallic tang of old equipment. He paused for a moment in the lobby, glancing at the corkboard pinned with outdated flyers. Missing cats, a local bake sale, a church charity drive from 3 months ago. Everything in Maple Hollow had a way of moving slow, except the nights. Nights could turn quick here. Dan hung his coat on the rack, revealing a worn flannel shirt and jeans. He adjusted the strap of his old leather satchel and walked down the narrow hallway toward the studio. His footsteps echoed softly, the only sound in the building. The studio door was heavy, padded to block noise. Dan pushed it open and stepped into the small room where he'd spent most of the last decade. The walls were lined with shelves of vinyl records and dusty tapes. The desk was cluttered with coffee-stained papers, a blinking digital clock, and the large black microphone that had become his only nightly companion. He sank into the familiar chair, flicked on the desk lamp, and the soft yellow light spilled over the mixing board. A single red light on the console glowed, waiting for his touch. He took a slow breath, letting the stillness sink in. It was the kind of stillness you only notice when you're alone. Dan tapped the mic. "Good evening, Maple Hollow," he said, voice smooth, professional. "This is Dan Harper keeping you company for another long night on WZPH 103.4. Lines are open as always. Call in, tell me what's on your mind, or just keep me from talking to myself." He leaned back, sipping from a chipped mug of coffee that was already lukewarm. The phone lines stayed quiet at first. He didn't mind. The night was young. Outside the studio window, through the thin gap in the blinds, the empty street glimmered under the streetlights. A gust of wind passed, swaying the single traffic light at the intersection. Inside, the station hummed softly. The warmth of the equipment made the air almost cozy. For the next half hour, Dan took the usual calls. An elderly man complaining about the new gas prices. A woman talking about her cat having kittens. A trucker passing through on his way to Ohio. Normal voices, familiar. Then at 12:28 a.m., the call that would change everything came in. The line clicked open, and a child's voice whispered barely above a breath. "Mr. Harper?" Dan straightened in his chair. "Yes, this is Dan. Who's this?" A pause. The voice trembled. I don't have a name anymore. I'm calling from the year 2041. Dan's hand froze above the console. He stared at the blinking light on the phone line, the faint static whispering between each syllable. "From the year 2041? He repeated, half smiling as if it were a prank. But there was something in the boy's voice, a raw, shivering fear that didn't sound rehearsed. "Yes," the child whispered. "I had to wait until now to call you. This is the only night it will work." Dan glanced at the studio clock. 12:28 a.m., still ticking steadily. "All right, kid," he said carefully, keeping his voice calm. "What's your real name? Where are you calling from?" A pause, just static, soft and thin, like wind over an empty field. "I'm in Maple Hollow," the voice finally said. "But not yours. Mine's burned." Dan leaned forward, his forearm brushing the warm edge of the mixing board. "Burned? You mean like a fire?" "Not fire," the boy said. "It's worse. I only have a few minutes before they hear me." Dan's fingers tapped unconsciously on the desk, a habit he had when trying to figure someone out. "They? Who's they?" The boy's breathing quickened in the receiver. "They're here. They always come before the hollow disappears. You can't see them, but they're in the air." In the static, Dan glanced instinctively toward the studio's corners, where shadows pooled in the dim light. The hum of the station suddenly seemed louder. "Listen," Dan said, trying to ground the conversation. "If you're in trouble, I can call someone." "No!" The voice cracked with urgency. "You can't help me. I'm trying to help you." Dan's hand tightened around the receiver. "Help me with what?" The boy's voice dropped even lower, barely a breath. "You have 3 hours before it happens. You have to leave the station before the second siren. If you wait until after, you'll hear them, and it'll be too late." Dan's throat went dry. "Siren? What siren?" But the boy didn't answer right away. The static grew thicker, fuzzier, as if a storm were rolling in, though the forecast had promised clear skies. When the voice returned, it carried a final chilling warning. "They know I called. Don't trust the light." The line went dead. Dan sat frozen, the receiver pressed against his ear long after the click. In the silence, he could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Or was it something else? He set the phone down slowly, his eyes flicking to the street outside. Empty, still. But for the first time that night, the glow of the street lights seemed wrong, too sharp, too cold. Dan sat back in his chair, the leather creaking under him. For a moment, he considered that it was just another strange late-night call. He'd had plenty over the years. People drank, got lonely, and called in with ghost stories or half-coherent ramblings. But there was something different about this one. The boy's voice. It had been too vivid, too desperate. Dan rubbed his face, glancing at the studio clock. 12:31 a.m. 3 hours, the boy had said. 3 hours until... What? The air in the studio felt heavier now, as if the walls had inched closer. The faint hum of the equipment sounded thicker, almost like it had depth. He shook his head, forcing a laugh under his breath. "You're letting a prank get to you," he muttered. But then from somewhere outside, distant, barely audible through the thick studio walls, came a sound, a long, low wail. It wasn't a siren, not exactly. It was more organic, as though it were part wind, part metal, and part something alive. Dan froze. His eyes darted to the window, but the street outside looked unchanged. The street light's glow flickered faintly, just once, then steadied. He leaned toward the glass, squinting. For a split second, he thought he saw something move at the far end of the street. Not a person, taller, leaner. The kind of shape your brain tries to explain away before you can focus on it. The phone rang again. Dan jolted in his seat, his hand hovering over the receiver. The sound of the ring was sharper now, too loud in the small room. He picked it up, but it wasn't the boy's voice this time. It was a man, older, voice rough and urgent. "Who just called you?" Dan's grip tightened. "Who is this?" "I don't have time for games," the man snapped. "Did a boy call you? About the hollow?" "You need to tell me exactly what he said." Dan hesitated. "Why?" The man's tone dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Because if you heard him, they've already marked you." The line went dead again. Dan sat in the suffocating silence, the echo of the man's words hanging in the air. And then, as if on cue, the hum in the walls deepened. Dan stayed seated for a long moment, staring at the silent phone as if it might ring again. The studio felt different now. The air thick and warm, yet the skin on his arms prickled with cold. He reached for his coffee mug, but the bitter liquid had gone lukewarm. As he took a sip, the studio monitor flickered. Just a hiccup in the feed. Then again, and again. He frowned, leaning forward to tap the screen. The static that filled it wasn't normal. It wasn't random. It moved in jagged, deliberate patterns, almost like shapes. And then, just for a heartbeat, he saw it. A pale, elongated face with no mouth, only eyes, impossibly wide, staring directly at him. The image vanished before he could blink. Dan's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the switchboard. "We're having some, technical issues here at KBXR," he said into the microphone, forcing a chuckle. "Guess the ghosts are feeling playful tonight." But no one laughed. The phone lines lit up all at once. 5, 6, 7 incoming calls. He picked one. "KBXR, you're on the air." A woman's voice, sharp with fear, cut him off. "Get out of the building, now." The line went dead before he could respond. Another call blinked in. He answered, but this time there was no voice. Just the faint sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like it was coming from far away. It sounded like it was in the same room. Dan turned his head toward the dark corner of the studio. Empty. He swallowed hard and hung up, his fingers feeling clumsy on the buttons. The clock read 12:47 a.m. Whatever was coming, the boy had said he had until the second siren. And now Dan was wondering if he'd already heard the first. The street outside was dead quiet. Too quiet. Dan pressed his forehead to the glass of the studio window, scanning the narrow road below. No cars, no pedestrians. Even the usual hum of the city, distant engines, the occasional bark of a dog, was gone. The glow from the street lamps looked weaker, as though the light had to push harder to reach the ground. Shadows pooled thick between the buildings, and every time Dan tried to focus on them, they seemed to shift. Then it came, the sound, the second siren. It rose from somewhere deep below the city. Not mechanical, but something older, more resonant. It made his chest vibrate and his teeth ache. Dan's knees felt loose under him. He grabbed the edge of the desk, fighting the sudden urge to run. The phone rang again. He snatched it up. "Who is this?" No answer, only that same slow breathing he'd heard before. Then a whisper, "They're crossing over." The line went dead. From the corner of his eye, Dan caught movement inside the studio. He spun around. Nothing. But the door to the recording booth was ajar now, just an inch when it had been shut tight all night. His pulse pounded in his ears. He stepped toward it, each creak of the floorboard sounding like a gunshot in the silence. He reached out, nudging the door open. The booth was empty, but the microphone inside was on. The red recording light glowed steadily, and from the speakers on the wall came a faint voice. Not his, not anyone he recognized. It was a chorus of whispers, all overlapping, speaking words he couldn't understand. except for one, repeated again and again. His name. The whispers grew louder, not like the volume was increasing, more like they were getting closer. Dan backed away from the booth, his eyes locked on the glowing red light. His name pulsed in the air, wrapped in that chorus of unintelligible words, twisting and bending in ways that made his stomach turn. Then the sound changed. It was no longer just voices. Through the static came snippets of something else. Footsteps crunching on gravel, the metallic slam of a heavy door, a child crying, then silence mid-breath. Dan clutched the desk for balance. He knew these weren't sound effects. They weren't coming from a recording. These were live, real, happening right now, somewhere. The studio lights flickered. The monitor showed static again, but now there were shapes inside it, moving like shadows underwater. Long limbs, bending at wrong angles, faces half-formed, as if the camera was trying to remember what a human looked like. The phone rang. Dan hesitated before picking up. KBXR. His voice was trembling. A new voice this time, smooth, calm. "Open the door, Dan." He swallowed. "Who is this?" "Your guest," the voice said pleasantly. "You've been broadcasting for us. It's only polite to let us in." Dan's eyes darted to the heavy locked studio door. Something struck it from the other side. Not a knock, a hit. The entire frame shook. The lights went out. In the blackness, the monitor screen glowed faintly. The shadows inside were clearer now, pressing against the glass from the other side, and smiling. The pounding on the studio door stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Dan's breath was loud in the dark, each inhale catching in his throat. He fumbled for his phone. Dead. No signal. The battery icon was frozen at 3%, unmoving, like a photograph of life before it drained. The monitor's glow was the only light left. And then it changed. No static, no distortion. The screen now showed the studio itself. His studio, but empty. The chair where he sat was vacant. The mic hung in the air like a noose. Dan blinked. The image blinked back. A shadow moved in the corner of the screen. Tall, thin, limbs stretching far too long to belong to anything human. It stepped into the frame. Its face was blank except for a mouth that began to open wider and wider, until the screen was nothing but black. The sound that followed was not a scream. It was the deep, tearing groan of the building itself. Something scraped along the inside of the walls, circling him. The temperature plummeted so fast his breath came out in clouds. Then the studio door opened. No creak, no resistance. It just swung wide. Beyond it was not the hallway. It was the street outside, but wrong. The lamps burned with a dim, sickly red light. The buildings sagged like wet paper. And the sky. There was no sky. Only a churning black void that seemed to pull the light inward. Figures stood in the road, dozens of them, motionless, faces covered in veils of shadow, all facing him. One step forward, the same voice from the phone, calm, measured. "You've kept them waiting long enough, Dan." He realized with a cold certainty that the second siren hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation. Dan stood frozen in the doorway, one foot still inside the studio, the other brushing against the warped, red-lit street. The figures didn't move closer, but somehow they felt nearer with every blink. Their outlines wavered like heat on asphalt, though the air here was colder than ice. The tall one with the calm voice tilted its head. "Step forward, Dan. You've been speaking to them for hours. It's time they spoke to you." He shook his head, gripping the door frame until his knuckles ached. "No, I'm not going anywhere." The figure didn't sigh, didn't frown, but the space around it seemed to contract. And suddenly, the others began whispering, the same voices he'd heard through the booth microphone. They all knew his name. They had always known it. Dan slammed the door shut. The studio lights flared on. For a moment, relief. But the chair at the desk was no longer empty. Someone, something, was sitting there. It's back to him. It spoke in his voice. "Good evening, listeners. Tonight, we have a special guest." Dan's throat tightened. He couldn't move, couldn't even shout. The thing in the chair turned slightly, just enough for him to see that it had no eyes, only smooth skin where they should be. Yet he felt its gaze pierce him. It reached for the microphone. From somewhere far away, the second siren began again, low and rising. The lights flickered and then died. When the station engineer arrived the next morning, the studio was locked from the inside. No sign of Dan, only an hour of dead air recorded overnight. Except buried in the static, a voice whispering a name, not Dan's.